This is not going to involve neural networks. This is kind of the kindergarten table as opposed to the university table. I like pretty pictures and things, and neural networks and AI are fascinating and interesting, but mostly over my head. Let's get started. I work for SPIN VFX. I'm the FX department supervisor there. I'm just going to do a brief introduction because they would probably appreciate it. We were founded in 1987 in Toronto as Side Effects Productions, which you might know about, the production arm of Side Effects Software. In 1992, the production division was spun off, and we were rebranded as SPIN Productions. Later, SPIN VFX. So Side Effects and SPIN actually used to be the same company way back when, which is kind of cool. Ironically, we didn't actually use Houdini at SPIN until about 2013, but that's a different story. We've evolved from our roots as a small boutique TV shop, doing a lot of commercial work, now to focus mostly on feature films and television. We've worked on over 200 feature films and 50 television series, including Game of Thrones, John Wick, Stranger Things, and a whole bunch more. And like a lot of people here, we are working hybrid, remote, in-person since the pandemic. And here is our reel. So I get to blow up a lot of stuff, which is fun. Who am I? I've worked at SPIN VFX since 2006, and I've been the FX department supervisor since 2009. I believe it's an empirical fact that effects artist is the coolest job ever, with the exception of firefighter, astronaut, and potentially firefighting astronaut. I've used Houdini almost exclusively for the last decade, and like many of you, I do wish there was a procedural, node-based workflow to solve all of life's problems. About the show, I'm going to be talking about True Spirit. So this was a Netflix film. It's based on the true story of a 16-year-old Australian sailor named Jessica Watson, incredibly brave girl who in 2010 circumnavigated the globe in a 10-meter sailboat called the Pink Lady. And in terms of requirements and references for the project, we knew we were going to have to create over 400 water shots. A lot of these would be sort of comp only, but over 100 involved CG elements. It was a small team of artists. It was a really busy time for the studio when this went through, so we were between 3 and 5 artists for the most part on this one, kind of fluctuating up and down. We needed to make sure, because the team was changing and it was pretty small, that we had a consistency of our process and our outputs from artist to artist. We wanted to get as close to a one-click procedural solution as possible for these ones. We wanted to be able to do our scene build, bring in our camera, run our setup, have it be consistent the first time out, and Houdini obviously makes that pretty easy. And we needed to maintain the visual aesthetic of the director, Sarah Spillane. Not 100% photoreal always. She wanted to push a little bit for a stylized look in some cases, but at the same time, she had a good sense of keeping everything anchored with the camera blocking, which I think really helped. I'm just going to do a select bit of some of the shots and maybe talk through some of these ones. So that's the ship, the Pink Lady there, 10 meters, so big enough to get tossed around in these waves. This is one of our storm sequences here. We had 2 main storm sequences, and we were kind of developing flavors for the oceanscape and the waves that we then kind of riff on each of the shots within them. So it was a mixture of live action photography, some cases like this one where we maybe have a small photographic element, some cases where we'd do a full digidouble for her. It was really kind of the best solution to fit the shot. This is our end storm sequence where kind of the stylized dial gets turned up a little bit further. It gets a little bit more into the realm of kind of how she was feeling, how the waves are making her feel. So it gets maybe a little bit further away from the ground truth of some of our references, but we still needed to maintain sort of the audience's investment in it, keep it grounded. And yeah, these were some fun ones. We had to get through them in a hurry, as I said, and and we did. This is kind of right at the end when we get super out there in terms of the scale of these things. I'm not sure if this actually is precisely what you went through out at sea, but you're allowed a little bit of creative license for these ones, and it's kind of more fun that way. These shots here underwater are actually a nice illustration of the asset that our asset team made for the boat. It was crazy detailed, like all the stickers on the hull, all the barnacles, all the little cavitation and bubble sims we had to work out, and we got very close to this thing, and it held up pretty well. So yeah, kudos to the artists painting on their Wacom tablets. And the triumphant reveal, she's made it through the storm. So in terms of workflow, on the bottom there, you can see this is kind of an example of one of the spectrum, the ocean spectrums that we developed for the first storm sequence. So this would be a master look that we kind of use throughout the sequence. The key to this was getting that spectrum approved, kind of locked off. It doesn't mean we wouldn't change it from shot to shot. Once we had our base spectrum, we'd give a cache of this to our animators, which are using Maya. It was a 250 meter square section of it. They could then bring that in there, move their camera wherever they want. They could position the boat and kind of animate freely, have their own little play sandbox with it. So they could offset our spectrum in time if they needed to get even more variation in the waves. Move the camera around, block it out. And then when it came time to bring it back into Houdini, we already had our spectrum there. We just needed the camera, the boat, whatever spectrum offset value they gave us as part of the metadata to publish. And we plug it into our scene build, and everything works, theoretically. So this is an example of that workflow. So this is what we would get out of Anim, their play blast, so they can play around with this gray shaded ocean in real time. This is the slap track, making sure our photographic elements are lining up at every stage. This is our QC mantra render, so just in a sort of with a test HDRI in there. And then this is the final shot, which is rendered through PRMan and put through comp. So flip sims obviously were important for this one. We were setting our container boundaries just based on first frame, last frame, plus pre-roll with our camera. We use guided flip sims for these ones, which can be a little bit annoying at times to deal with, but it was the best way to kind of get some of those large scale features in there. And one thing I found, a downside for using guided flip sims is if you rely entirely on the guided flip sim, you lose some of the crisp detail you'd get just using sort of the normal spectrum deform workflow on your meshes. So we handled this by splitting out our low frequency and our high frequency spectrums. So the lower frequency ones, the big waves that are really important to getting the motivation for the sims, those ones were fed into the guided flip sims. The high frequencies were done as the post-process. And what am I showing here? Sorry. Did I run out of internet access? That's awesome. I think that was just going to be an example of the node network, how I was hooking those things in. For the flip sim, which is going to happen sort of on the high frequency part of this, or sorry, for the flip sim, which is the low frequency stuff with those inputs, the collision object we're using needs to compensate for that deform we're going to add to the mesh after the fact. So to correct for that, we would apply an inverse of our spectrum deform to the collision geo. So basically, we've got our boat. We're going to be adding these nice high-frequency waves, which I would have showed in the last video. And it's a really simple, just taking the position minus the spectrum deformed position, pushing it backwards so that when we snap the water into place, the boat snaps back into place with it. And here's an example with a simple guided flip sim. So this is just a medium res one I put together for this. So it's feeding in those low frequency spectrum ocean fields. And then you can see afterwards we've got our high frequency one applied as a post deformer. So you're getting those crisp peaks. When you render it, all your reflections are nicely broken up by that high frequency deform. Similarly, the whitewater sims can be done on that guided spectrum one with that SDF and Vel field as your input, and then you just apply the same high frequency spectrum afterwards. I'm actually going to go back and see if I can play that video because it's nice to see. Oh, there we go. So here's the components of the spectrum that made up one of our storm sequences. So we've got our low frequency spectrum. It was made by combining three. So this is just to get some real large scale variations in the ocean. That's one of the things you find in larger storms. You get these really big 10 meter, 20 meter scale ones. That's our medium spectrum, which is kind of the main movement. And then our high frequency on top of this, which is giving you some of those crisper fine details moving on top of them. So you can see here, these are not being filtered by resolution. These are reference copies. So each one of these for the low frequency one above resolution 3, it's getting filtered out. So we're taking kind of the broad strokes of the movement. That's going into our flip sim. And then similarly for the high frequency one, we're filtering below a resolution level of 3. And these are the details that are going to be added post sim. And here's an example. The top one is the combined spectrum. And then we've got our low frequency one and the high frequency one just solid out there. So that's one thing, but what I'm going to talk about more is kind of what's going on with the rest of the ocean, because the flip sim really just accounts for a tiny portion of this. The rest of it, in some cases 80 or 90% of the frame, is everything else, and what do we do with that? Because that's really going to kind of be what the audience takes in the most. So we needed a solution for generating the foam bubbles and spray that would fill the frame back to the horizon and could be potentially detailed enough to work in the foreground areas, because in a lot of cases, the flip sim is in the midground rather than the foreground. It had to be a procedural solution, again, as close as we can get to a one-click first pass and take advantage of our farm's ability to run many jobs in parallel. So this is what we came up with for all that background stuff. The only real input for this is camera and ocean spectrum. Everything else kind of gets done from there. So on the left here is our farm submission mechanism, so you can go through stage by stage. If you don't like part of it, you can go back in. And as the density of our point sim increases, as the density of our sim points decreases along with the distance from the camera, meaning that the further we get in space, we still want to see those ocean points. We're scaling them up to maintain in screen space sort of a visual consistency. And this is kind of the components here. So the top part of this is just our emission. Then there is a splash sim, which comes off of the peak of these ones. The splash sim, the areas where the splash lands, is then going to generate surface foam, which sticks to the surface. That's what's going on down here. Then we've got spray coming off of that to give you that nice misty detail coming off the peaks. And then underneath the water as well is you get this bubble and aeration sim. And this couldn't be something where we're using the normal whitewater thing, which is really great, but it does not work well over this kind of scale. So this was kind of our own solution to it. So this was an example I put together just taking kind of a basic ocean spectrum and plugging in with the defaults that we used out of the show. So there's probably some room to improve, but you get splashes coming off the peaks, you get surface foam that sticks fairly well, you get bubble detail underneath the surface. And I'm just going to break down sort of an example going through a smaller patch. So this is just a 15 by 15 meter square, so this goes through really quick in terms of sims. And I'll show you the components that make that up. So the first stage is getting the ocean foam emission. This is just using a standard ocean foam SOP. Now the bounds of this are set procedurally based on the frustum of the camera. The one thing I'm adding in at this stage that differs is a set of repellent points, which are going to be used for the foam sim to create kind of those cellular features in there. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. That's set, and then after that, the point density gets culled based on the camera origin. And then I'm setting the velocity of the points based on the ocean spectrum as well, just so they're not sitting there, they're actually inheriting the movement of the waves. This is going through there, so that's where I'm setting the density of repellents. So the number of repellents spawned per frame can affect kind of the scale of the detail. So that's something, depending on the spectrum, you may want to tweak. This is just very simply getting the camera origin, finding the distance to it, and ramping out the amount of points that get culled. That doesn't really apply for our example with just a little square there. And then taking your ocean velocities and adding them back in. So for the splash sim, the main kind of crashing detail, this is done in displaced spectrum space rather than kind of in flat XZ space. So I'm applying the ocean spectrum to those emission points and then running these through here. Noise is added to add some variation to the velocity and sort of the emission areas. And I needed a way to test when these things are going to collide with the surface and have to get killed. I experimented with a few ways of proxy collision surfaces and things. The fastest way ended up being literally just taking the point location, zeroing out the Y value, and reevaluating with your ocean spectrum. And you can downsample that to make it even faster. And that lets you chew through just a ton of points and have these things die at the appropriate level. And in this case, it's kind of a dumb particle sim, just has gravity, drag, and wind force. But in a lot of cases for foreground areas, you can absolutely use pop fluids. You can feed this into a flip sim. And rather than rendering as points as I was in those examples, you could mesh this and render this along with your water. And this is just diagramming the points that turn red here are ones that are actually making contact with the surface. So those are going to generate foam later. Because at a certain point, I was noticing you get splashes off the top of these peaks and they land on the surface. And then if you don't get any foam at that point, it kind of gives away the game a little bit. So what I ended up doing was those areas that were tagged as hitting the surface, I would apply an inverse ocean spectrum to get them back into XZ space where the foam sim was run. You could, I guess, theoretically generate a gigantic SDF and run your whitewater stuff in place in the final world position. Not super efficient for something like this. So this all goes back to 2D space for this. And this is the first pass here in XZ space of the surface foam. So you can see the little cellular structures there. Those are generated by the repellents. You can maybe see here in red. And so for each one of these points, there's a SOP solver that's just going through some vecs that takes the nearest repellent point and applies a force to it. So if it's within a certain radius defined by the repellent point, it's going to push it out. If it's beyond that radius, there's going to be a much weaker force pulling it in. So in that way, you get kind of these bare areas, but then you also get this little force pulling it back in to kind of bring you these stringy details. It's a really fast operation, but if you add a bunch of variation into it, you can get some pretty nice foam detail out of there because it's a really simple pop sim too. If you have any custom forces you want to add in there, it's really simple to do. So I was adding random distance and push-pull strength per repellent point, so you can get some ones that are larger, some ones that are smaller. And on the right is just the series of ramps that were built to control that. So again, you can take a look at your first pass and say, oh, it's nice, but the foam features are a little big or a little small, there's not enough variation. And it's really simple just to fool around with the sliders and get something that works. All of this is done just using the Vex near point function to keep things speedy. It was only evaluating one closest neighbor for each point, which because of the speed of this worked fine. And then this is the foam deformed back into the ocean spectrum space. And I think that's where inheriting the velocity helps here. And it gives it a little bit of a leg up over using some of the other solutions. For the spray off the top, this is almost even simpler. So this is done in displaced spectrum space. So after the foam and the other elements get displaced back into that position, they get tagged for emission. And I'm rendering these in 2 groups. So it's emitting some particles that I'm turning into a VDB volume and rendering kind of as a misty pass. And at the same time, we found taking a small percentage of those and rendering them as really sort of low p-scale, high opacity points that kind of just give you those little minuscule micro droplets. That kind of let your eye perceptually build the bridge between the small scale and the large scale. And we found that was a pretty easy way to imply that all of those big soft areas of mist actually had a lot more detail than they did. Because again, we had to cover just a huge amount of space. For added detail, you could absolutely advect this by a velocity field if you did a pyrosim along the surface. We did that for some of the shots where we wanted nice little swirling details over the peak and all of that. For background areas, you can replicate that with some larger pop forces. And then finally, the bubble pop sim for these ones. This was pretty simple, to be honest. This was just a matter of taking our initial spectrum points and emitting them into a sim and XZ space that would push these things down below the surface. They would have a buoyancy force that would pull them back up to the surface, while at the same time they'd grow fainter and wider. Simmed in XZ space based on those original ocean foam emission points. These were given an initial velocity with the Y component, just taking the absolute value of the Y velocity and making a negative. Pretty simple solution, but it ended up working. So the more energetic these things are, the more cavitation force there's going to be pushing this underwater. Then at render time, these were deformed with the ocean spectrum, and I was modifying the position by just taking, again, the Y position value, taking half the P scale and pushing it down just so we didn't get any stuff penetrating the surface in an awkward way. And then these were rendered with a low opacity and a large P scale as a phantom object below the water's surface. Self-shadowing, we disabled for most of those ones to save on render cost because you want them to catch shadows from the boat or whatever, but you're never really going to pick up on shadows from within the bubble volume itself. And then this is just that example there with all the layers there. And obviously, comp can tweak all these components. Some of them would be rendered together, some of them would come out separately. But really, the driving force between this setup was to get something that was really, really quick to go through, so you could run a test patch of ocean and know it's going to work across the whole thing. And again, throw it onto our farm. We could, run 70 sims in parallel. So it was really nice to be able to. In contrast to the way flip sims usually work, where you're waiting hours and hours and hours, then you've got your meshing. For this one, we could, run an average shot in a couple of hours, if not less, depending on the scale of things, and absolutely run it at a lower detail to get kind of an idea of what everything is going to do there, and then crank it up for the final product. And it's all particle driven, which means it's fast, which is always good. In terms of additional considerations for the show, rain and mist was important, and again, because of resources, we didn't have enough time to create something super duper custom for every shot. We kind of needed to have a solution that worked as a first pass. So rain was a pop sim emitted from outside of the camera frustum. So basically just at a position where it would reach terminal velocity by the time it hit frame. We'd be scattering points on there with a bunch of random velocity values and density values. Our global wind, the same one that would be affecting all our mist sims and everything, was affecting these ones. And we made sure to render with acceleration motion blur here. We didn't want to cache out all the subframe detail, but if anybody's tried rendering particles with acceleration motion blur and some geo substeps in there, you get a lot of nice detail that we found was good enough to avoid kind of the curse of those really straight particle velocity motion blur lines that can take you out of a shot. The mist was a low-res camera for custom VDB, so we kept it really low-res for render time and efficiency. All the detail was in the shader. So we had a couple frequencies of noise that we were pumping into density that were, again, just being offset in the direction of our wind value. So if we had wind going along the x-axis, that's the direction that our textures were being offset in. If we were to just do a single, frequency of noise on this, you'd get kind of a not too pretty slideshow of noise going across the screen. We found combining different frequencies of noise with different flow rates, different offset speeds, combined with the rain pop sim was enough to kind of visually make you feel like there's something more complex happening there. Sometimes it would take a little bit of time to figure out something. You don't want patches of density disappearing or whatever, but it was, again, so interactive that that it really made it easy for the artist to dial in and get the look they were after. And then the last component here is wet dog spray off the boat. Again, one of those little touches that we wanted to automate as a baseline. Kind of all of these are just designed to be our first pass, and then the artist goes in and tweaks. But in this case, we wanted the boat to be able to shake off little droplets of water. We wanted water going down the hull of the boat. So as a starting point, we had a setup that would, in the rest position, just have a cycle of water dripping down the boat. I don't know how many people have done that tutorial with the Coca-Cola can and the drip trails and all of that. That's been around for a while. This is pretty much similar to that workflow. And then after that, those were being deformed. Sometimes we were using an extract transform and then a point deform for our sails coming out of CFX. Once it was in there, we still had all our particle ID values. We used that to recalculate velocity and acceleration, which let us find those periods when there was big changes in acceleration, so big changes in speed, and that just triggered points being thrown off, and they were rendered similar to the rain. Again, a really simple setup you could run almost in real time, and it just added one more little layer of detail into the scene. Since this project, this was done, I believe we delivered it in 2023, so a lot of the work would have been done in 2022. SideFX has put a lot of nice new features in there that we could have leveraged, but in particular, the soft fluid stuff for variable containers is super nice. This was a test I did using that same setup, just modifying it for soft fluids. And in this case, there's a couple of sharks coming in with very different paths. And in the old days, obviously, you'd have to draw a big rectangular grid around the whole thing and waste a ton of detail. And the soft fluid workflow is super duper efficient for that, which I like. And all of the custom foam stuff that I showed you still plugs in because it's still the same ocean spectrum input. And then again with soft fluids, and this is something I want to play around with more, this was a test I did using the UpRes workflow. And in particular, those little yellow test debris objects I put in there. That one was driven by a low-res version of this flip sim, so I might have done a first pass at a quarter or even an eighth of this resolution, and then taken the vel field from that and pushed that into a bullet sim. Anybody that's tried to do a two-way flip sim knows that RBDs and flip sims don't play particularly nice. Like the RBD solver is kind of old and kind of not very nice to deal with. Bullet sims are fast and modern and new and shiny and all of that. So in this case, we could use the vel field from that first one into a bullet sim, have it push all the debris, and then take out those bullet objects and use those as colliders for the high-res sim, which you run after the fact. It's not a perfect workflow, but it's pretty impressive how much the detail stays the same from pass to pass. So I don't think we've used this exactly in production, but that's probably the way I do it. I'm very willing to be convinced of a better way to do it, but it's really nice. And also, you've probably seen some of the examples where you can pick an area of your scene in the foreground. So let's say if I wanted that area in the front of the street to get more detail, you could really easily define a domain there and up-res that one. So that's kind of the future, and I'm honestly looking forward to a project where we get to play around with that a little bit more. And in terms of something I want to acknowledge, there was a presentation done for a Hive function last year by Diogo Guerrero. If he was really nice, he would have put it out before we worked on our show, because that would have helped. But it's called Storm of Possibilities, and there's a whole tutorial series that goes along with it. He does a really nice job of kind of explaining some of the workflows. He uses a slightly different method than the guided one we use. He's using kind of deformers he sims it all flat and then deforms everything after the fact. It's a nice way of working. And if anybody hasn't checked out Igor Zanuck, he's an artist that's done just a ton of flip development work. He's done some stuff for Side Effects, exploring some of their new solvers. We were lucky enough to chat with him for a couple hours at the start of the project and bounce some ideas off of him. And he's a super bright guy and a super friendly guy. So we were really happy with being able to pick his brain. And then our team for True Spirit, I just wanted to shout out Nisha, Wes, Justin, Paul, and then all of the artists, I think 3 of whom I've ran in today. They did a great job in a short period of time turning things around. And it was one of those shows that was fun to work on despite the huge amounts of data we were pushing and the size of the task ahead of us. And that's pretty much it from me. I would love to answer questions though if anybody has any. Thanks.
Super cool stuff. Of those call-outs too. Diego and Igor put out some really nice stuff out into the community, so that was helpful, as you found, which is great. Questions? Anyone?
Thank you very much for the presentation. You insisted a lot in trying to come up with a very efficient workflow you could run in a few hours to process a shot, which is amazing. Did you end up in situation for some very key shots where that workflow wasn't sufficient enough and you had to take a different approach? And can you talk through those challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. Like some of those big shots at the end, the waves were treated more as just kind of a hero surface where we were more sculpting them and doing it that way as opposed to just using the ocean spectrum. We certainly couldn't have afforded to do that for every shot, but for some of the key ones, we would do that. Also, we had any number of shots where the director would see it and say, oh, that's cool, but we want a little wave in this part of it here. And we would basically just layer those on as per shot changes. So if we wanted, you know, a little wave in the right side of frame that wasn't part of the base spectrum, the ocean tools make it super easy just to mask that area and either reapply the same spectrum with a bigger amplitude or swap in your own waves. We use the function where you can draw a curve and push a wave along that curve quite a bit. And then especially with the foam and spray, creating custom masks is pretty easy. If you want more density here, a lot of times they'd say, oh no, we want extra spray coming off the top of this one. Just basically paint a mask, and because it's all being deformed, your point count is pretty much consistent in that area. So it's one of those things where getting that first pass out was super important, and then once you're there, you can play with it and respond really quickly to director's notes. So that made it nice.
Sweet, thank you for that. And just a quick question, I'm curious about your workflow with animation. You mentioned you were exporting Alembic cache to give them. Can you talk why did you decide to do that as opposed to give them an HDA with the spectrum itself?
I didn't quite catch all that. Sorry. Instead of, you could have very well given them an HDA, Houdini HDA with Ocean Spectrum, and they could have played with it. That would have used the Houdini engine license, which with the number of animators, that was the stumbling block there. And they're also super used to that Alembic workflow. So in a perfect world, yeah, they actually probably could have done that. They could have switched between multiple spectrums in an HDA. And if it was maybe a smaller team with 1 or 2 animators where it was a little bit more tightly integrated, we might have done that. But this was just kind of what they were more familiar with. And then part of our tech check process, they could also include that Alembic surface, which would be already a product in our publishing system. So when they did a tech check, that would already show up in their renders. I'm sure we could have figured out an HDA way to do that as well. But it came down to licensing more than anything else.
Thank you.
Other questions? All right, Tim. Well, thanks very much. Great stuff.
Thank you.